Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here. When the last speaker mentioned people in Vladivostok who say they're going to Russia, reminded me of people in Britain who say they're going to Europe. Now, let me... I want to actually talk today, I want to shift the focus a little bit. I want to talk about the broader relationship of free speech to human rights. Human rights, which, as I'm sure many of you know, have in a sense become the kind of international or indeed even global language of ethics, overwhelmingly the language that governments and international organizations use in order to judge the conduct of states, of organizations, of corporations, and so forth. And one of my recent interests has been, I'm not sure that we even know what we're talking about when we use the phrase human rights. And so rather than jumping in and talking about free speech, I want to take a step or two back and talk about the very concept of human rights. Human rights, of course, is a system of justice. And the idea of justice is certainly nothing new, right? Throughout history, there have been many models of justice. Here's a few which I'm sure will be very well known to you, right? We can point to any number of belief systems throughout history, throughout many cultures, which in some way could be understood or indeed overtly present themselves as systems of justice, right? Going back thousands of years. And indeed, this great variety of cultural traditions and historical traditions is often cited as evidence that human rights have something universal about them, right? Because we point to all sorts of ancient traditions, we see all sorts of notions of justice which seem to have certain overlapping qualities, and therefore we come to the conclusion that human rights as understood today must be universal. It's amazing how many people think this. Now, what I would say is that when we look at all of these ancient traditions, they certainly are concerned with justice in the sense of delivering human goods, right? So if we think about ideas that a government should not torture, a government in other ways should not treat people arbitrarily, or brutally, that a government should not wage war wantonly, that a government should ensure that certain minimal levels of goods, food and so forth, are available. These are certainly human goods. My question is, what makes them human rights? And my great objection to the ways in which we use human rights, and particularly in international organizations today, is that the notion of goods and the notion of rights are simply conflated as if they mean the same thing. Again, the notions of these sorts of basic goods have been around forever. The idea that these goods do or should take the form of rights is a very recent idea, and I think in many ways, again, one which we've just simply collapsed, right? We've simply collapsed the notion of rights into the notion of goods. And I want to know how free speech matters to all of this. What have I just done? Oh, there we go, sorry. So I want to know what turns human goods, again, ideas about goods have been around forever, into this very rather recent notion of human rights. I think if you were to ask a kind of run-of-the-mill human rights lawyer, they might start out by saying, well, yeah, what makes these things rights is the idea that they become formally incorporated into legal codes. And, you know, you've probably all seen these sorts of documents, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are trillions of them, often now parts of national constitutions, in fact, and often very much part of national law in many countries. But of course, we know that simply putting rights on paper in many places means absolutely nothing. So the purely formal incorporation, the rights on paper, as we know, are clearly not enough to turn goods into objects of right. So what else is required? Well, you might say that it's not about formal incorporation, but about effective incorporation, right? So it's not simply a matter that the law kind of formally or officially incorporates, kind of shopping lists of goods, but also that there have to be some sort of mechanisms to make sure that people can access these goods. But again, this is still very open-ended. Well, what does that mean? Again, we know that in many places in the world there are, one or another kind of mechanism, but still human rights are massively violated. And so, in order to try to get, I think, a more precise notion of human rights, of what is distinctive about human rights as a system of justice, as opposed to what makes human rights just collapse into, 1,000 ancient sorts of systems, what I would propose to do is ask, well, how do we actually go about pursuing a right? Let's try to take it from that perspective. And of course, we know there are many ways. I guess the classical model of the pursuit of a right, is the fully fledged courtroom situation, right? You feel a right has been abused, so you go to court, right? And you seek to vindicate your right. But of course, we know in actual practice that's really one way, and perhaps the least common, right? There are many other ways of pursuing rights. Sometimes it's simply a matter of lobbying legislatures. Sometimes it's a matter of dealing with administrative agencies. In other words, there's no one procedural mechanism. There are all sorts of ways in which people might pursue their rights. For me, the question is not so much what kind of means or channels are available. My question is, again, what happens when these don't work? What happens when these break down? What happens when these don't give a result which you feel is adequate? And my argument is that ultimately, free speech is the only thing you have. In fact, it's quite interesting. If we look at, for example, at Jakob's presentation from this morning, someone like Václav Havel talking about democracy and free speech, right? Now, he could have put democracy with all sorts of so-called human rights. He could have paired democracy with not torturing, or with fair conditions of detention, or with adequate levels of food and so forth. But there was this kind of intuitive understanding that free speech is not just another right. That free speech is somehow the necessary condition for the possibility of human rights, as opposed to just human goods, to even come about, right? To give you, we could think of 1,000 concrete examples. China could start torturing people less today. In so doing, it would certainly be providing human goods, but it's simply wrong to say that they would thereby be respecting a human right not to be tortured, something that no one at the United Nations understands, and no one in most of the human rights organizations understands. They would immediately applaud China for respecting a certain human right. Why is China, in that particular circumstance, not respecting non-torture as a human right? Because no one there has it as a right. Why? Because they can't speak about it. So they might have it as a good, not as a right. You don't have it, so that brings me back to my question of legislators, courts, administrative agencies. Unless you can actively, safely, without restraint, complain about what your legislator is doing, what your courts are doing, what your administrative agencies are doing, anyone concerned with the provision, with the delivery of human goods, then you're simply not talking about human rights. You're just talking about goods. Now, goods are good. They're not rights. No one at the United Nations understands this, or most people who teach and work in the human rights world today. And so they would say to you, well, free speech is already a right. So what's the problem? That's what they'll always tell you when you raise these objections, right? And this is why I'm trying to argue that free speech, again, it's not just another item on the checklist of human rights. If you were to ask pretty much any expert today, the overwhelming principle in human rights today is known as the principle of indivisibility. We cannot prioritize rights. We have to treat all rights as equal. Each right is necessary for the full enjoyment of all the other rights. So food, torture, housing, education, fair trials, right? Each one is equally necessary. We cannot come up with any hierarchy. I think that is almost correct, except for free speech. I think for all the others, that's absolutely correct. And this is what happens when you make free speech, which is the condition for the possibility of turning goods into human rights, when you just make them another item on the checklist, you actually destroy the necessary condition for a regime of goods to become a regime of rights, right? So the doctrine of the co-equality of rights is a misapprehension of the very concept of human rights. And the priority here is not ontological. I'm not saying that in order to survive as a human being, free speech is more important than the rest. I have no idea about that. I'm only talking about the possibility for human goods to become a legal regime of human rights. So I'm not saying that that free speech is ontologically prior. I'm saying that it is legally prior to the possibility of a human rights regime. Obviously, if I'm stranded on a desert island, free speech is probably the lowest on my list of priorities. But if I'm stranded on a desert island, I'm not in a human rights regime or in any possibility of there being one. And so if essentially the United Nations and pretty much all of the illustrious human rights bodies around the world today, if actually they're not even doing human rights, well, what are they doing? And what I would say is what we have in place are as good as you're going to get in a world like ours, managerial regimes of goods. This is pretty much how I would characterize what goes on at the United Nations today, right? Again, a kind of sheep farming. Is there enough food? Is there enough water? Are you being kind to them? Not too much torture, not too much abuse. The way you would properly treat a herd of sheep. What we don't have are regimes of human rights, which could only ever be citizen-directed. And citizen-directed means the possibility to criticize, to challenge, to mock, to lampoon. Take this example. If you were to kind of spend your days, as I'm pathetic enough to do, plowing through sort of United Nations human rights reports, you're looking at all the different committees. Pretty much they all follow the same model, right? And so you would come up with the sort of thing is like, Norway is doing very well, North Korea not so well. So after you've read literally tens of thousands of pages of documents, the only conclusion you really come up with is that North Korea just sort of needs to catch up. They just need to try harder, do a bit better, right? And maybe someday they'll be like Norway. And that's it, as if these are just quantitative measures. You just kind of go down the checklist, all the different human rights, right, and see how every nation is performing. I think this is insane. I think this is insane. If that's the best you can do, give us Norway is doing better and North Korea is doing worse, then that has nothing. You don't need human rights to say this. You're just talking about goods. You're just talking about sheep farming. What we need to find out is that North Korea is not set up to be a human rights regime, nor is Putin's Russia, nor is Xi's China, nor are many other countries on earth today. They're just not set up to be human rights regimes. Maybe some of them deliver goods. But if their citizens cannot safely, without fear, speak out, then human rights we haven't even crossed into that threshold. And once again, our international organizations are simply deluding themselves and us when they keep talking about a human rights system that doesn't exist, right? I see that my time is running out, so I'm going to skip over a few points. Perhaps they'll come up later on. I just want to say, to conclude then, I want to address one last question. Often when I make these sorts of remarks, people then wonder, well, are you advocating free speech absolutism? If free speech is a kind of prior condition before a human rights system can even exist, then am I advocating a kind of absolutism? Because surely if we were already to assume restrictions on speech, then it's hard to see it as foundational. Now, for all sorts of reasons, again, maybe they'll come up later. I won't have time to talk about them today. I've talked about them in some of my publications. The concept of free speech absolutism is simply an absurdity. There could never be any such thing. A free speech absolutism would simply collapse any legal system. Again, I won't go into the reasons for that, but I'll happily discuss that later if it should come up. What I think is foundational, it's not simply the right to say anything. What I think is foundational is that no speaker is excluded from the public sphere solely on the basis of their viewpoint, their worldview, their philosophy. For me, that is the foundational moment for the very possibility of human rights. And this is what I call viewpoint absolutism. Free speech absolutism, again, I'm saying it's a legal nonsense. There could even people, the most libertarian state could never have free speech absolutism. It would collapse in a day. Viewpoint absolutism is altogether achievable and, as I'm saying, necessary. I think I have to stop, all right? So if you want to find out more, I'll do my quick plug. In fact, I just got an email yesterday. It's coming out in paperback, if you want to save a few quid. And if you're a real nerd, if you're a free speech nerd, then this is my previous book where I really go into all the mechanics about these things like absolutism and so forth. All right, then. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Can I just ask you? Yeah. Just one follow-up. It's enormously exciting what you're talking about here. How if we understood the UN and everybody else understood what you're saying about human rights as the fundamental right, how would we go about it differently?
Yeah.
What would be the consequence if everybody knew this?
I'm looking less for perfection and more for honesty, because I think the way in which the human rights discourse has now taken over, it's done that at the price of its own collapse, of its own emptiness, its own vacuousness. I believe that there may be about 20, 25 democracies in the world today that could be held to the standard that I'm discussing, and I know that's not many. I know it's a privileged few. I have no illusions about that. And I know that there are many states that are very borderline where it's just hard to tell. The United States might be one of them. And I have no problem with that with appreciating that kind of complexity. Of course, that kind of complexity will always be with us in politics. But I want us to be honest and clear about what we mean when we use the concept of human rights. And if we simply mean human goods, again, sheep farming, right, then let's just get rid of the concept of human rights. Let's stop deluding people. Let's stop making a promise, which many powerful organizations make and governments make. Let's stop making a promise which one doesn't even understand when making it. The language of rights can be powerful, and that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking to return to the time when the people who first really thought seriously about individual rights saw it as a means of empowerment, right? As a way to involve the individual and organizations and groups in the process of the fair and transparent and efficient delivery of goods.
Right. But what you're saying is that it has to start with the individual right, and not as something that we as a state give to you because we want to give it to you. This is a difference, I guess. I mean, is the conclusion is then that we have to be much more realistic about how to achieve rights and how far we can go.
Realistic is okay. Honesty is better, right? We always have to be realistic.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. But again, maybe I'm just jaded by spending too much time reading through these United Nations and NGO reports, because they do just, okay, Russia, China, North Korea, they just go down their list and they tell us how they're doing in terms of human rights performance.
Right.
Right? They have to acknowledge that they're. There's one of the things I say in my book is that people can be sort of bouncing the ball around the court and doing a spectacular performance, but that's not ice hockey. That's basketball. So don't talk about how they're performing when they're doing ice hockey, because they're not doing ice hockey. If a regime is not even set up
right.
to do human rights, let's stop evaluating them in terms of something they're not doing.
Right.
And they have no intention of doing. And they're very clear about that.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Thanks.